September 1st, 1939, marked the outbreak of a war that should never have happened. It was an accidental war in Europe. Nobody wanted to fight except for one man, Adolf Hitler. It was the last day of peace in Europe, and no one suspected what disasters were about to engulf the continent. By the evening of August 31st, the Polish capital had gone dark as a precaution against air raids. Windows were sealed shut everywhere. In Warsaw, the greatest fear was poison gas attacks. That evening, recalled musician Władysław Szpilman, the subject of Roman Polanski's famous film The Pianist. Nobody doubted that war with the Germans was inevitable. Only incurable optimists still clung to the illusion that Poland's firm stance might impress Hitler. Berlin, by contrast, was brightly lit, but beneath that surface, cracks were showing. Trains had stopped running on schedule. Getting gasoline had become difficult. On August 27th, rationing of food and clothing went into effect. The party congress was canceled. "Everyone I've spoken to," reported CBS Berlin correspondent William Shirer, "is against the war. How can a country wage war if its population opposes it? Resignation, not enthusiasm." That's the German reaction to the war. In September 1939, the majority of Germans wanted peace. Hitler wanted war. Back in August 1914, young Adolf Hitler had been among those who enthusiastically greeted the declaration of war. In September 1939, things were different. No triumphant crowds, no flowers for departing troops. Germany wasn't ready for a major war, and the military command knew it. Even the Security Service's secret reports on the domestic situation sent to the Reich Chancellery noted the lack of enthusiasm and the country's inadequate readiness for war. But Hitler had already given the order: destroy Poland. The Third Reich's ideological machine had transformed Poland into the German people's primary enemy. The press was full of stories about the alleged injustice and cruelty of Polish authorities toward ethnic Germans living in Poland. Goebbels's propaganda apparatus turned any piece of news about Poland into material for hatred. Liberating Germans from Polish oppression was made to seem like a righteous cause. The intelligence services received instructions to manufacture a pretext for the war that was already being planned. They decided to stage a Polish attack on some German target. On August 17, 1939, Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command Staff, ordered Abwehr Chief Wilhelm Canaris to obtain Polish military uniforms, weapons, and documents, and hand them over to the SAS as quickly as possible. The operation was assigned to an SD department head. The operational team headed to the small town of Gliwice, near the Polish border, and checked into the Oberschlesischer Hof Hotel. They registered under false names, posing as mining engineers. Hotel staff believed the Germans were searching for mineral deposits in the area. Gliwice had a small radio station. Remarkably, it still stands today, though its tower is made of wood. The team's task was to stage a takeover of this station by Polish bandits. For authenticity, they needed bodies. A job assigned to Gestapo Chief Heinrich Müller. The plan: dress a dozen condemned prisoners in Polish military uniforms, give them lethal injections, then shoot the corpses several times to present as evidence. The team waited at the hotel until the order came on August 31st. The Germans easily seized the unguarded radio station, and a broadcast in broken Polish called for war against Germany. Afterward, the operatives staged gunfire live on air. The world heard those shots. The European powers had, until the very last moment, tried to avoid repeating the catastrophe of the First World War. They were willing to do almost anything except go to war. Paradoxically, the only way to stop the war was through a credible threat to start one. In its first years, Nazi Germany was so vulnerable that Hitler would have backed down if confronted with real danger. But the European powers kept retreating, reinforcing his belief that he was acting correctly. With each step, the West's half-hearted threats tested his opponent's resolve, and Hitler proved right each time, because the Western powers repeatedly chose to make concessions. "I prefer to fight while I'm still in my prime," Hitler said. At 50, he considered himself at the peak of his powers. For Germany, entering the war was an extraordinary gamble. Hitler improvised, and his self-confidence overwhelmed the will of other politicians. They simply couldn't believe he would risk his own country. Britain and France didn't know how Stalin would behave. If the Soviet Union provided Poland with military support, the outcome of the campaign would become unpredictable. On the eve of the Second World War, the Third Reich was effectively bankrupt. The balance of payments deficit was covered by printing money. There were no other reserves left. The Reichsbank's leadership informed Hitler that the Reich's gold and foreign currency reserves no longer existed. No currency meant no purchases for what the Wehrmacht required. Hitler's response was to dismiss the Reichsbank's president, Hjalmar Schacht. On April 15, 1939, General Walter von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, presented Hitler with a report. The shortage of high-quality steel echoed the situation of World War I. The army lacked the steel needed to equip its forces. Due to the steel shortage, production of the 105mm howitzers that formed the backbone of German artillery had been cut in half. Production of army rifles, the infantry's main weapon, had stopped entirely. Months later, General von Brauchitsch again appealed to Hitler for help. Copper had run out, and Germany had none of its own. It had all been imported. In May 1939, Major General Georg Thomas, head of the Wehrmacht's Military Economic Office, presented his calculations to the High Command. Germany was allocating 23% of its national income to its armed forces, France 17%, Britain 12%, and the United States only 2%. In other words, the Western powers had enormous reserves to draw on for building up their military strength. The economic potential of the Nazi state's adversaries already exceeded Germany's own. 2 weeks before the invasion of Poland, General Thomas reported to the Wehrmacht command. The country was being drawn into a prolonged world war that Germany, due to shortages of raw materials and food, would not be able to sustain. Economic difficulties were already showing. Tanks and automatic weapons were reaching the troops with significant delays and in quantities insufficient for extended combat operations. In the autumn of 1939, the Wehrmacht's combat capabilities and the state of Germany's war economy allowed for only a short war against a weaker opponent, Poland. The generals were perplexed. What if France struck immediately in the west? But Hitler operated on a different logic. Time was working against Germany. The Wehrmacht was losing its advantages with every passing month, and delaying the war made no sense. But he desperately needed, at the very least, Moscow's benevolent neutrality. Nazi diplomacy went into overdrive. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop told the Soviet chargé d'affaires, "From the Baltic to the Black Sea, there are no problems we cannot resolve between ourselves. On the Baltic, there's plenty of room for both of us, and Russian interests there will in no way clash with ours." Stalin read the dispatches from Berlin carefully, but delayed making a final decision. The situation in Europe was growing more tense. Soviet historians claimed the pact with Hitler had been signed to prevent the formation of a united anti-Soviet front, that Moscow supposedly wanted to build a united anti-fascist front in Europe instead. In reality, the Soviet Union faced no risk of isolation. The Western democracies couldn't have allied themselves with Hitler. What's true is that they didn't want war and had long been making concessions to Hitler, naively hoping the Führer would be satisfied with limited gains. Many in the West cynically hoped to set their adversaries against each other, and the same cynical hope existed in Moscow. Western military delegations from Britain and France arrived in Moscow first. All they needed was Stalin's assurance that the USSR wouldn't support Nazi Germany if Hitler attacked Poland. On the eve of the talks, one of the Comintern Executive Committee's leaders, Dmitry Manwilski, joked about a Moscow bride. The room laughed. "But we know our own worth," he added to applause. "And if we make this marriage, it'll be a marriage of convenience." He continued, "I won't say, as the English press does, that an agreement between the Soviet Union, Britain, and France is already in the bag. It might be in the bag, or it might be nothing at all." In 1939, the Soviet Union found itself in an enviable position. Both warring camps were courting its favor. Stalin could choose Nazi Germany or the Western democracies. In August, Stalin made his choice. Many to this day credit him with wisdom and foresight, claiming this move bought the USSR time before the inevitable clash with Germany. But the documentary record from 1939 shows that, neither economically nor diplomatically, was Germany prepared for war with the Soviet Union. A confrontation with Germany in the autumn of 1939 would have ended in a Red Army victory, and Hitler wouldn't have dared wage a major war against Russia with a hostile France at his back. By the summer of 1941, however, Hitler would have no remaining adversaries in Europe, and the Wehrmacht would be a transformed force. So in 1939, Stalin made a mistake that would cost Russia tens of millions of lives. Stalin agreed to negotiate with Hitler at the very last minute, and the Führer was forced to accept Stalin's terms. When Hitler was informed that Stalin was willing to receive Ribbentrop, the Führer reportedly leapt up in excitement. The German ambassador to Moscow, Count Friedrich Werner von der Schulenburg, wrote to his friend Elisabeth, Ali von Dirksen, that this was only the second time in his life he'd written to her about something like this, so that at least she would know who had won this 100% victory, as he called it, calling it a diplomatic miracle. On August 23rd, Ribbentrop flew to Moscow. He and Molotov entered swift, frank negotiations and immediately reached agreement on Poland. The state was to disappear from the political map of the world. At that moment, Hitler was willing to agree to anything. Stalin had freed him from the fear of fighting a two-front war. Close to midnight, all the agreements were sealed in a secret additional protocol to the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact of August 23, 1939. The document was signed by Molotov, which is why it became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In the early morning of September 1, 1939, the bombing of Warsaw began. I was woken by the roar of explosions, Władysław Szpilman recalled. It was already light. I looked at the clock, 6 in the morning. The war had begun. People on the streets of Berlin appeared remarkably indifferent, as if nothing had happened. 5 heavy anti-aircraft guns had been set up to protect Hitler while he addressed the Reichstag. His speech was broadcast on every radio station. Whoever resorts to gas will receive gas in return. Historians have noted that Hitler was off by a full hour. The first shot of World War II was actually fired at 4:45 a.m. by the German training ship Schleswig-Holstein, which had docked at the port of the city of Danzig, today the Polish city of Gdansk. The German ship shelled the Westerplatte fortress. Little remains of it now. The war began at Danzig, and Westerplatte became the site of the first battle of World War II, which is why it became a symbol of Polish resistance to the Nazi invasion. Only recently has it come to light that World War II actually began a few minutes earlier, and in a different place. The first strike wasn't delivered by the German Navy, but by the German Air Force. Germany's Air Force was considered the most advanced in Europe. By September 1939, it had 4,000 combat aircraft, divided into 4 air fleets, half of which were used in the attack on Poland. The massed use of Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers and tanks gave German generals the ability to achieve rapid breakthroughs, allowing them to crush the outdated Polish army within 3 weeks. The headquarters of the 4th Air Fleet was located at Karlsruhe Castle, near the Silesian town of Rosenberg. The Special Missions Officer, Major General Baron Wolfram von Richthofen, personally briefed the commanders of a bomber squadron. Their target, the small Polish town of Wielun, about 100 kilometers east of Breslau, today Wrocław. The mission, destroy the town. The special objective, test newly arrived, modernized bombers fitted with more powerful engines, capable of carrying half-ton bomb loads and diving on targets from high altitude. Wielun had always been a backwater, its residents mostly farmers, and the town had changed hands many times throughout history. In 1793, it came under Prussian administration. In 1807, thanks to Napoleon, it returned to Polish control. After the partitions of Poland, and before World War I, It had been under the administration of the Russian crown. Residents believed they had nothing to fear. Wielun had no railway station, no industry, except for a sugar factory on the outskirts. The town's only military unit, a cavalry regiment, had been moved closer to the border that spring. Naturally, the town had no anti-aircraft guns and no bomb shelters. 29 Junkers from the 76th Squadron, commanded by Captain Walter Siegel, took off from an airbase at night. Fog had settled over the airfield, but Captain Siegel sent his planes up strictly on schedule. It was morning. The flight took about 20 minutes. At approximately 4:35 a.m., the dive bombers, sirens blaring, descended on the sleeping town. The first bombs fell on the western part of town. The target was destroyed. Today a school stands on the site, but on September 1st, 1939, it was the Catholic Hospital of All Saints, and it was on this hospital that the German pilots dropped their first bombs, even though they could not have failed to see the large red cross on its roof. I had gone to bed very early, recalled a doctor who survived the bombing. Suddenly, there was an explosion on the hospital grounds. The window panes shattered with a crash and rained down onto my bed. I jumped up, grabbed my clothes, and ran outside. At that moment, the building behind me collapsed. It turned to rubble. Groans came from everywhere. The first bomb alone killed 2 nuns, 4 nurses, and 26 patients. The German Air Force made 3 passes over the town. But why would the Germans bother to destroy a provincial town even before the war had properly begun? There were no Polish soldiers in Wielun, and the German pilots knew it. The town wasn't bombed to eliminate some imagined enemy. Wolfram von Richthofen was testing his modernized Ju-87s on live targets, and Squadron Commander Captain Walter Siegel was making amends for a past failure. Weeks before the war began, in August, his squadron had demonstrated its combat readiness before high-ranking officials at a training ground on the German heath. The pilots were meant to show what the new aircraft could do. The exercise called for simulated bombing runs at low altitude. Fog caused a disaster. The young pilots misjudged their altitude, and 13 aircraft crashed into the ground. The war redeemed him. On the eve of war, every pilot who could fly was needed. By destroying Wielun, the captain proved his usefulness to the Reich. On September 2nd, tanks of the 1st German Light Division entered Wielun. Among the divisional staff officers was a young Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, the man who, 5 years later, would attempt to assassinate Hitler in order to end the war and save Germany. But back then, in 1939, he hadn't yet doubted the Führer's righteousness. Filled with contempt for the Poles, Count Stauffenberg wrote to his family from Wielun. The land was nothing but sand and dust, and it was a wonder anything grew there at all. He described the local population as a kind of rabble, people accustomed to being ruled with a whip, and noted that thousands of prisoners would prove useful in German agriculture, working diligently and willingly. He stressed the importance of beginning the colonization process. Poland was meant to become a colony within the Third Reich, with Poles becoming strangers on their own land. The Nazis had far-reaching plans for the town. The SS intended to establish a model German settlement here, with everything Polish destroyed. But they never succeeded in making the town fully Aryan. On the night of January 19th, 1945, Wielun was liberated by forces of the First Ukrainian Front. Honoring their commitments to Poland, France and Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd. They still had no intention of fighting in earnest, but retreating any further had become impossible, and so began, shamefully, the Second World War, which nobody except Hitler had wanted. Act 8. We're in good spirits. The extreme tension of August 1939 during the War of Nerves had felt unbearable to people at the time. The Polish-born literary critic Marcel Reich-Ranicki recalled the strange mood of those days. How, incredible as it might sound, when news came of the attack, many people felt almost relieved, barely able to contain something close to happiness. I immediately sent my sister, who lived in London with her husband, a postcard, he recounted, in which I wrote, "Of course it won't be easy, It might even be terrible. But we're in good spirits, because we have no doubt at all that Germany will be defeated. Historian Richard Pipes recalled that radio broadcasts helped sustain people's morale, including appeals from Warsaw's mayor, Stefan Starzyński. Along the roads, remnants of the shattered Polish army trudged by on carts, wounded soldiers among them, all in tatters, downcast and dejected. On September 8th, the Germans launched their assault on Warsaw, but met serious resistance. The Poles didn't consider their situation hopeless. They expected the French to immediately enter the fight and draw off significant German forces. They also counted on Soviet neutrality, which would allow them to redeploy their entire army to the west. On September 5th, Georgy Dimitrov, secretary of the Comintern's Executive Committee, requested a meeting with Stalin to determine what position communist parties should take in this war. This war is being fought between two groups of capitalist countries over the redivision of the world, over world domination, Stalin explained to Dimitrov. We wouldn't mind if they fought each other and weakened one another. Stalin called Poland a fascist state. Under the current circumstances, he said, that would simply mean one fewer bourgeois fascist state. And what would be so bad about that if, as a result of Poland's defeat, the socialist system were extended to new territories and populations? Stalin's directive was formalized as an order from the Comintern's Executive Secretariat to all communist parties. The international proletariat could under no circumstances defend bourgeois Poland. The Poles defended their capital fiercely. Men and women dug trenches right in the city streets. For days, the city was bombed mercilessly. The worst raid came on September 25th. The final bomb fell on Warsaw on the afternoon of September 27th, when the city's defenders surrendered. In just a few days of bombing and artillery bombardment, 20,000 people had been killed and 50,000 wounded. Hitler had been pressing Stalin to enter the war against Poland. He needed military support. He needed Soviet participation in the campaign. Molotov had replied evasively, "We believe the time has not yet come. Perhaps we're mistaken. But it seems to us that excessive haste could harm us and might help unite our enemies." On September 14th, the military councils of the Belarusian and Kiev military districts received directives to take up positions against Polish forces. On September 17th, Soviet troops crossed the Polish border. Streets named after September 17th can still be found throughout western Belarus, and were once found in Ukraine as well, because in 1939, at least initially, much of the non-Polish population genuinely welcomed the Soviet army as liberators. There were reasons for this. In one town stood a former Polish concentration camp, where so-called subversive elements, enemies of the Polish state, had been imprisoned without trial on the basis of police decisions alone. That camp had been notorious for its especially brutal treatment of prisoners. Beginning on September 22nd, after the diplomatic corps had evacuated Warsaw, the bombing of the defenseless city continued. Planes flew low overhead with an ominous roar, dropping bombs on civilian targets, while artillery shelling began each night. On September 23rd, the radio station fell silent, destroyed by bombs. By the next day, there was no water and no gas. There hadn't been for some time. Buildings collapsed, burying thousands of people beneath the rubble. Crowds fled through the streets as planes flew low, machine-gunning them. By evening, Warsaw was engulfed in flames and resembled a Dantean inferno. One eyewitness said he would never forget the scene before his eyes, between Siena Street and Marszałkowska Street. Dead horses, burning buildings, and people running in panic. Act 11. A ceasefire and the conqueror's arrival. Polish command began negotiations to surrender the city. Warsaw capitulated. The following day, a 42-hour ceasefire was declared. After 2 p.m. on September 27th, the guns fell silent and the planes vanished. An eerie silence settled over the city. On September 30th, German forces entered Warsaw. Of course, Warsaw looked different then than it does now. but the intersection of Marszałkowska Street and Jerusalem Avenue was the city's center at the time. An open car drove right up to that spot, with a German officer standing upright inside it, photographing the crowd with the air of a conqueror, while the crowd watched him in silence. On October 6th, Hitler himself arrived in the city. He wanted to see the capital of the defeated state. His car drove down Marszałkowska, Warsaw's main street, with armed German soldiers stationed every few meters. The Poles watched, powerless. Hitler could have been killed at that moment, but no one dared to try. In 1939, the Brest fortress, familiar to us from later history, also defended itself against the Germans, though at the time, it was defended by Poles. They held out for 3 days before surrendering, with several thousand taken prisoner. On September 22nd, Soviet forces arrived, and the German command handed over the city, the fortress, and the Polish prisoners of war to the Soviets. A week before the war, addressing his generals, Hitler had said, "In essence, there are only 3 great statesmen in the entire world: Stalin, myself, and Mussolini. Mussolini is the weakest. Stalin and I are the only ones who see the future clearly. So, in a few weeks, I will extend my hand to Stalin across our shared German-Russian border." The German occupation forces commander, Tank General Heinz Guderian, set up his headquarters in an attractive building that, under Polish rule, had housed a government audit office. Today it serves as a regional security administration building. Under the agreement between the two countries, Brest was to be handed over to the Soviet Union, and German troops were to withdraw. To mark this brotherhood in arms, a joint parade of Wehrmacht and Red Army units was held on September 22nd in Brest's main square. The parade was reviewed by 2 generals, the famous tank commander Heinz Guderian and Soviet brigade commander Semyon Krivoshein, appointed garrison commander of Brest. They stood side by side, exchanging friendly smiles. In his post-war memoir, Panzer Leader, Guderian wrote that Krivoshein spoke French, which made communication between them easy, and that all matters were resolved to the satisfaction of both sides. Their stay in Brest concluded with the parade and a flag exchange ceremony. Both generals stood on the steps of a building that, under Polish rule, had belonged to the regional administration. The square itself had once been named after Piłsudski, and a statue of Piłsudski had stood where a statue of Lenin would later be erected. The troops, infantry and tanks, marched along streets that at the time were paved with cobblestones rather than asphalt. Guderian and Krivoshein would meet again 2 years later, in July 1941, in battle near the town of Propoysk, which Stalin would later order renamed Slavgorod. Krivoshein's military career fared better than Guderian's. Commanding a mechanized corps, he distinguished himself in the Berlin operation and was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The Poles had fought with honor. Over 4 weeks of war, the Germans suffered heavy losses, 90,000 killed and 63,000 seriously wounded. The German Air Force had exhausted its bomb stockpiles and wasn't prepared to continue operations. Germany's limited economic capacity meant it would take 7 months to replenish those reserves. In less than a month, a quarter of Germany's combat aircraft had either been damaged in battle or had broken down. The Panzer I and Panzer II light tanks proved entirely unsuited to modern warfare and needed replacement. Yet during this critical period for Germany, between October 1939 and October 1940, tank production was actually cut in half. Germany found itself economically isolated. The entry of France and Britain into the war had cut it off from foreign supplies. Imports of critical raw materials, oil, iron ore, copper, fell to crisis levels. An economy entirely dependent on imports stood on the brink of total collapse. In other words, for at least 6 months, Germany was in no position to wage war. But the European powers failed to seize this opportunity to crush the Nazis. Germany's weak military, economic, and demographic potential should have doomed Hitler from the start. Yet his audacity, combined with the short-sightedness of European politicians, and with Stalin's cooperation, allowed him to win victory after victory in a war he should have lost. On the occupied and partitioned territory of Poland, the Nazis revealed their future intentions. Himmler demanded the rapid expulsion of all Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, and Jews from Polish territory, with Germans resettled in their place, so he could report to the Führer that these lands had been returned to German administration. Only those Poles found to have Nordic blood were permitted to remain. Children from such families were taken from their parents and placed in orphanages, to later be matched with German adoptive families. These children were told their parents had died. By the end of the war, the Nazis destroyed the files documenting these children, and many never found their birth families. Southeastern Poland was turned into a general government with its administrative center in Kraków. The head of this administration brought along his personal writer, Hans Jost, to document how the former Polish lands were being transformed. Jost's book described all the key figures of the occupation regime: the Governor-General of the occupied Polish territories, SS Obergruppenführer Hans Frank, and the senior SS and police leader for the Lublin district, Odilo Globoknik, whom Himmler affectionately nicknamed Globus. Globoknik couldn't resist boasting that he had just liquidated the patients of a Polish psychiatric hospital. A group of SS men had led 300 patients out into the courtyard and shot them on the spot. Himmler ordered the establishment of a system of concentration camps across the general government's territory. Globoknik was the first to use gas vans, trucks with sealed cargo compartments, packed with people, and then filled with exhaust fumes. Himmler praised the men of the SS, describing how, carrying out the Führer's will in their hearts and acting with complete conviction in their own righteousness, they boldly took on whatever tasks were assigned to them, in everything that was demanded of them. "I love the pioneers of our state," he said, "who demonstrate to the new provinces the laws of our race." In June 1941, Heinrich Himmler gathered the SS's senior leadership, including the writer Hans Jost, for a confidential conversation during a friendly gathering by the fireside. Himmler told them that an attack on the Soviet Union was imminent, and that he wanted to set new tasks for the SS. They would be tasked with exterminating between 20 and 30 million Slavs and Jews. The machine, set in motion by one man at 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, was gaining momentum, and by now it was almost impossible to stop.